So this is Chris DeLeon.
Hello, everybody.
Yeah,
I said DeLeon like it's
DeLeon. Okay.
It's DeLeon 5th Street.
All right. So Chris, tell us your story. How did you
Sure.
get into video games? Why did you want to do it?
Right. So
tell the story.
Yeah. So obviously grew up playing video games, as many of us do or did. And like, and for my generation, it was like I'd hold the duck hunt gun against the screen when my hands were too small to deal with the game controller, so I could just try to get those ducks. And I just thought it was so neat that we could like change things on the screen. I liked that every single cartridge had like a whole world inside it of different characters, different ways things worked. And like I wasn't even necessarily that great at them. I just like thought they were neat and all different and all exciting. And I've also always thought it was cool ways people could find, like, when there were adults with imagination, like Robin Williams was always great with this kind of stuff. Like, he had that to his personality, and I wanted a life path that kind of involved still an outlet for that kind of thing. And started actually started programming. I was young. I was basically an early teenager, and I had seen a comic about like this kid who was told to write something on the board 100 times, and he wrote a program instead on the board that like repeats the statement 100 times. And I was like, well, I mean, it's not alien language. Like you can see there's 100 there, and you can see there's a thing in quotes, and that's like the thing he was asked to write. It's not impossible to understand. Human beings write this. So, stumble into a bookstore because the internet was not as good then as it is now. Found C for Dummies, and at the time my thinking was like, okay, well, I make A's and B's, I guess, so like C's seemed like a good place to start. I didn't understand C is actually like an industrial standard, top level, fairly advanced programming language with like low level memory allocation and stuff, but that's kind of just didn't have any guidance, didn't have any mentorship. It was, early, mid-90s, and that got me into programming. And then thereafter, like a lot of programming puzzles seemed very abstract, and I've always been a very hands-on, very practical person. I loved woodshop in high school. I loved art class where I could make things with my hands. And I found game making was a kind of a way I could take that programming and make it less abstract. So it was like, my problems I was solving wasn't, sorting data or these kind of things. It was like, okay, I want my character to do this, and he doesn't yet. And you could solve puzzles to make it do that. And so my first few games were remakes of old classics. I don't know if you remember Snake from like Cell Phone and those kind of classic things. That was one of my first graphical games. We made a version of Pac-Man. We made a version of Breakout with the paddle at the bottom. Lots of these kind of classic things. And then when I got into school, went to college, I found basically like my productivity on it exploded when I started getting teams involved. When I stopped trying to do everything myself, when I stopped trying to have to switch hats between every single role, which I still kind of like, but realizing that when I worked with different people, every team I worked with, we'd make a whole different thing because different people brought in different strengths and talents and interests and priorities. And that really excited me because it suddenly mixed things up, because I found myself kind of starting to repeat myself when I was just doing kind of my little solo bit. And then thereafter, it was just sort of finding that there were companies that paid people to do these kind of things for them. And so now have gone through a variety of large companies, small company, independent contracting, my own company, twice, of different ways to make games professionally. And so something I like to do in speaking, and I hope with various kind of festivals and other stuff, is talking about those differences of different ways we can make games in our lives, different ways that can impact our career, different ways that are kind of useful as skill, practice, those kind of things.
Okay. Now, what kind of stuff did you have to study to kind of get into video games?
Sure. So computer science is consistently one of the things people point to as like a really strong thing that it's useful in areas that really set game developers apart. There's ways to make games. To be perfectly fair, like there's a part of game development that's kind of like just, like I said, I was kind of a woodshop kid, like hammering the board together and like sanding the thing. Like there's just steps in programming that aren't really computer science. But when you know those sort of advantages of algorithms and data structures and stuff, set candidates apart in terms of when the problems get tricky, you can pull things off other people can't. And so that's one of those things that really helps a resume float to the top of a pile or helps someone stand out in an interview when they ask them, what? My phone thinks I need directions to here, so let me pause that. But yeah, so computer science set it apart. I'll also say it's increasingly the kind of thing that humanities, even though it doesn't seem like it's as computery, for at least to various kinds of the job, I went to graduate school for, it was actually like a branch off of a literature program. It's called digital media, but it was really off of like media impacts of how do different kinds of games affect communities and ways people play them and how do people relate to each other in online spaces and all these just different kind of questions, because like the really interesting bits are kind of like even past the technical, can I make it do that, into why do this instead of that is kind of a much more dynamic kind of space. One of the things I like about game programming is that it's not a kind of puzzle where there's like a single right answer and someone got the right answer and someone else didn't. it's like music creation. Like there's a million possibilities that's going to be right for somebody unless it's somebody else's thing. And so there's like this infinite space to explore of keeps changing on us. So many things are possible. Everyone who gets involved has their own vision they want to bring to it. And it's just, to me, keeps it interesting. It's always kind of different.
So did you find like the world, because a lot of people play video games, right?
Yep.
But how do you actually get into I mean, I know it's not easy,
right?
But how did you go about getting your first job as
Sure.
just a guy who wanted to make video games?
So first job, and this was before indie games were a thing. Now there's a whole bunch of other pathways I can talk about. I've seen people go through of finding various kind of different forms of it. First way we did it was I had started a club for other people to get together and make games together. That was my first experience of team projects. And we would invite in guest speakers to the club. I'd say, you know, hey, if you want to come talk to us about what you do with EA or what you do with Activision, what you do with whatever game company, like they'd love to hear it. They're an audience of people who are all early in their beginning. And those kind of companies want to invest long term in like getting in a good word with people who are prospective in the future and might want to work there. And that was actually how I got my first internship, was through one of our guest speakers. Said if anybody has resumes, let's see them. Followed up after that, and that's how I got my first. It was actually at EA LA, which is now EA Dice. It's over on Jefferson here in the city. I was coming out of Pennsylvania, so like I wasn't from out here. But obviously this is the part of the country where like there's a bunch of different studios kind of all up and down LA. And then through that, a few years of that down the line, I shifted from that to a startup. It was a Silicon Valley company, started by someone who was actually a member of that club I had founded. Co-founded with the guy, in fact. And so like, he was starting a small company. That was my first experience with kind of like being that close to entrepreneurship. It was a group of 5 instead of, at EA, I was on a team of 250 people. Very different kind of project. But like that came again from that club. And so really it came from like, basically when I realized I didn't just want to make games alone, but I was open to making games with others, the network was sort of automatically forming from people I had worked on projects with, people I had created things with. It gave me an excuse to introduce myself to people on behalf of the club or to bring in speakers for the club. And it's just so much easier to kind of speak on behalf of others, of like, hey, I'm trying to help these people out. Do you want to come speak to our people? And in the process, like, you get noticed also because you're kind of front-manning the group in a way, or lead singing the band, of trying to find, you know, go out there and passing out effectively. I actually made a version of a resume that wasn't my resume. It was like the club's resume for like, look at all the things the club's done. Send your recruiters to us and talk to us and that kind of thing.
So basically what you're saying is, it's kind of like a hustle to get in there.
There's a lot of hustle to it. I think, and especially because of post-indie game scene, by which I refer to like when, you know, there's games you buy off shelves, there's games you buy that are $60 products, and there's also like really smaller games, the $1 apps on iPhone, the $10, $20 games on Steam, that are like 2 to 3 people, sometimes done in their part-time hours, sometimes they're small businesses, whatever. That side of the business is really much closer to like trying to make it as a musician or a writer. Which is to say, like, so many people are doing it, and there's this kind of like thing no one sees, where when I give talks, I show a picture of this band, and it's a black and white photo, and they're on stage, it's in a gymnasium at like a high school, and there's like 12 people dancing, and the band is the Beatles. But like, what I like, no one knew who they were, no one cared what they were, but they had so many years of like that before they were the Beatles. And increasingly for like indie game development, it's a lot of that going on. It's people who are keeping like some other steady day job while they're on the weekends, on their off hours, fitting in their dream project, in a way that because they're making it their own way on their own time, no one else has command over kind of creative control direction of saying, oh no, you got to do it this way, copy this competitor's product or do it the other way. But there's always those kind of trade-offs of, obviously at some point, some companies will choose to have the predictability and steady paycheck that comes from, give someone else creative control. One of the things that kind of forms in the middle is a lot of small game companies will balance contracting, where outside people, sometimes it's a advertising company. I have friends who worked on games that advertised yogurt. One of my first contract gigs was making a game advertising solar panels in California. Like they could earn points for a coupon to install or whatever. And those companies, like, they're not even really worried about like, is this game amazing? Is this game going to be a hit? They just want to be like the hip, cool company that has like, we have a game with our logo in it. And so they pay a decent amount of money just to build that thing. And a lot of indie game developers will balance those things with their personal projects. And so like one of my other guys we have at Speaking for Stuff, Jake Burkett, he's been making games now professionally for 15 years as an independent game developer. And his income has actually been like fairly steady, not humongous, but fairly steady over the years. But the percentage of that is his projects instead of outside projects, has shifted. So now it's almost 100% his games and his projects and his vision for things. Whereas when it began, it was almost entirely outside contracting service work of got to keep the lights on, got to be responsible, family to take care of, etc. Finding someone else who would pay them to solve their problems if we need a game about blank or port our game to mobile or those kind of things.
Okay. So what kind of games do people out there like? I know you like to kill many people. I think the collective kill amount here is what, like over 400,000 people.
Those are baby numbers.
Right. Okay, only 400,000. So what kind of games do people play?
Role-playing games.
Dark Souls.
Name some games.
Halo, 2K18,
Dark
Madden
Souls.
18, GTA 5.
Morrowind.
Just you keep it simple. You're like right in your lane.
Yeah.
What do you
Let's
play?
go. Last two, right?
The Last of Us?
Yes.
Sorry about that.
Right, yeah,
All right, Last of Us is a good. All right. So what's one game that we can all agree that we've all kind of played? Call of Duty? GTA? All right. Let's start with GTA.
Sure. Yeah.
Give us your. I don't know if you worked on a game like that, but maybe in a game of that scope.
Right, yeah.
What goes into making a game, that $60 game that you buy on the shelf? What are all the parts, the moving parts to make it happen?
About a $200 million budget, separate from the marketing budget, which is also at least $200 million. Those are the kind of games that wind up obviously on billboards and TV commercials and in front of movies and things. And something I relate to, like in our practice clubs, because our club teams are people who kind of off hours and stuff, is that like I can enjoy a cruise, and like as a consumer, like if I have a chance to go on one, like I'm not going to say like, oh no way. But as someone who like as a crafts person who just likes to build things, I can like kind of have more fun building a canoe in my garage of like it's mine, I own it, this was my idea, I built that with my bare hands. Is a different kind of process and scale than like being a welder on a cruise ship, which again, like those get built by thousands of people working together. And the same is true for GTA 5, some of these other giant games, where there are so many people involved that we wind up with lots of people where they're all some of like the most talented people in the world at their very narrow craft. But like I know a guy, and this is a slight exaggeration, he had a little more leeway than this, but we kind of referred to him in the company when I was with the Airborne team as like the hand animator for the studio. And it was like, if someone else wants to animate hands, you don't get to, Paul's doing it. And it's like, Paul wants to do something else, sorry, we need Paul on hands because he's amazing at that. But it's harder to point to the whole game and be like, this was my idea, that was what I added to it. And I think part of what I learned about that, one of my first mentors, older guys who was a professional game programmer I kind of spoke to, like when I made games when I was younger, it was always just like, I had these ideas I wanted to make, I wanted to create these characters and stuff. And what he said was satisfying to him was like when he was in theater in high school, he liked being on the crew. He liked being in the all-black suit and like sneaking on stage when the lights were out and moving the furniture around. And he found it satisfying to be part of something so much bigger than what he could have done alone. And he kind of liked the fact like if it was the wrong play to put on or if the acting wasn't on par or whatever, wasn't his problem. And like as a software engineer, like what he did at the time was he worked on network backend for multiplayer. So Command and Conquer and those kind of games. When the like internet would drop from some player and the whole game runs seamlessly, it's because of like really low-level stuff he does on servers and packets and transmission and whatever. So it's hard to point to the game and be like, oh, he did that tank or he made that character. But like he liked that he would go to work, be given these like challenging puzzles to solve them, feel good about it, I did the thing today, go home, sleep safely, not wondering like if that was the wrong decision, that was someone else's decision about what puzzle to solve. And so there's a lot of kind of bits and pieces to that. Also at those kind of games, and again, my closest example would be when I was with the Medal of Honor company, team at EA, was like it's lots and lots and lots of communication and meetings and process. In a way that I remember, so Katie Charmoda, she's another person I met through one of my clubs, she's now with Oculus, and she would relate that a lot of people complain about like, oh, middle school projects, high school projects, can't wait to get out of these projects. Like game development is kind of like one giant middle school project forever. Like you have to work with different kinds of people. Some people who any given day like may not be as thrilled about it because something else complicated is going on in their life, and that's reality of long-term projects. But like learning to love that, learning to see the benefit of it, learning to enjoy the perspective differences, learning to navigate the company politics, which at any giant company, there's dynamics of who gets along with who and who to try to meet with separately and who to try to win over to your side. And but you know, those are a product of constantly inside those giant projects. Like they have to pay off an immense sum of money. So someone mentioned Minecraft. And Minecraft is a good contrast because it's this rare indie darling of not started that when he still had a day job. By the time Mojang sold for literally billions of dollars, it was still like less than a dozen people at Mojang. And that's such a rare case, but like that amount of money sounds like a whole bunch of money, and it is, but is like a quarter of the money involved in like EA, Activision, Ubisoft, or whatever a year. Of like, they need to make way more than that, consistently, predictably, every time they release a Call of Duty, every time they release The Last of Us, every time they release an expansion pack, every time World of Warcraft does an update, whatever. The numbers they're dealing with are staggeringly enormous. If they're paying 9,000 salaries, they're paying for campus and facilities in 19 places around the world or whatever. And those numbers add up in a way that like you have all these risky, weird ideas for like, oh, but what if it did this? And there's all these process layers built in step of like, yeah, but like, is that going to lose us more customers than it gains us? Is that going to still satisfy people who've been with the franchise up until this point? And so a lot of what I actually see now is that I'll get a lot of friends who are in industry with there's some big part of that giant process, and on the side, they're still doing their own weird games where they have this like bizarre outlet for this crazy idea they want to do, and they tuck it away into their side project instead of trying to wedge it in appropriately to like, does it fit in the giant companies? Like, this needs to be about shooting zombies and that's it. And like really nail that well. See, a couple of questions.
Yeah, you mentioned that, the side hustle, the making your own concept. I think one of my favorite stories of that is that's how Link's Awakening was made. They were making a Link to the Past at the time, and they wanted to make another Legend of Zelda game, and they didn't quite know what to do with it, and they wanted to do all kinds of different things. So they made a little side project, and they included all kinds of Mario characters and all of that, and it turned into this game.
Yeah. And the dynamics of those things change tremendously by company. There's a degree to which, and it also depends on the state. One reason why there's so much tech industry in California and in Washington is we have specific protections in California. At the very least, I can't speak to Washington's. That like if you do it in your own time, with your own equipment, without your coworkers, without bringing it to work, etc., like they have a way harder time trying to claim ownership over that. In lots of other states, like if you are working for GE and in your off hours you invent a toaster or something, like that's theirs. That's just part of like the employment agreement. We have labor code in California that protects like that's not theirs. Now obviously it can't like use their IP, can't be built off their stuff. Now also I think you mentioned the League of Awakening. Japanese game industry also works incredibly different than the US industry. And there's these very bizarre stories of like Shigeru Miyamoto, who obviously everyone knows who he is. But like there's this great interview of him in like the mid-90s from US news people. By this point, he was already 10 years after Mario. He'd already Donkey Kong created. Star Fox was new. Like he'd done so many things. And he was still like mid-level game designer in the company, not ludicrously rich. In a way that like in the United States would be like, I'm pretty sure Will Wright or Sid Meier, whoever should like be loaded because they did these things we've heard of. In Japanese game companies, same thing from the guy, Toru Otani, lead for Pac-Man. Like his career didn't skyrocket. He wasn't given everything he ever wanted. He was like, just very grateful for the chance to work on this game that reached so many people, kept making steady income off of it. The dynamics of those offices are very different than the US ones. So occasionally we hear examples of things happening in Japanese companies that in US companies would play out very differently. There's a few cases where I think Alice in Wonderland, the American McGee, is actually one of the examples of he worked at EA at the time and had kind of like sort of inappropriately used some time or workers or whatever, and it became an EA game as a side effect of that. I can't speak to the particulars, I'm not a lawyer, but I think that's one of those examples of like, yeah, just to be aware of those things. It's actually another reason why sometimes people will opt instead to apply the same kind of skills, design thinking, project management, programming, to some other related industry. So not in games, but they're at Google, they're at Microsoft, they're at Apple, they're at IBM, they're whatever, in a non-games division working on Internet Explorer or whatever, getting paid steadily to do that, and the company has like no care at all about this web game you're putting out or the iPhone game you're building or whatever, because that's not the market that they're in.
Samaj?
I wanted to ask, well, I just kind of got here, so sorry about that.
No problem.
But I wanted to ask, like, how do you continue making a game interesting? Because a while back, I'm really big into Halo. I've really been big in the Halo universe. And I found out that Halo 5 was actually a rush job.
Well, yeah.
And it's like, the campaign was very short, it was kind of wonky, and they kind of didn't really get to where they wanted it to be. But yet the multiplayer is amazing, but it's starting to kind of die out because now everybody wants Halo 6 to come out. And like, how do you continue making a game like that interesting?
So there's a number of considerations that, again, at that scale of business, like Halo and Bungie, et cetera, I can't speak for them, but I can speak in at least some generalities of things from people I've interviewed and whatever. Part of what comes up is that, and I see this all the time of like, you know, oh, it's kind of like it's Zelda again, it's Mario again, it's Metroid again, it's Call of Duty again, it's Madden again, whatever. At some point we're like, gosh, why are they not keeping my attention? Sometimes those games like aren't for us as people who played the earlier ones. It's for the generation after us who like won't go out and buy a PlayStation 1, who won't buy an original Xbox. And like now this is their version of they need it on their 4K monitor. They need it on their whatever that they have that the old game didn't support. And so when I was on the Medal of Honor team, I was like, this is like the 13th Medal of Honor. Are we like, why is this Medal of Honor instead of like World War II something else? And they were like, well, because like this will be the first one on PS3. And like that was legitimate. Like, okay, when we have to like, how can we up the ante of the graphics, of the gameplay, of things that lets us do, couldn't use before. The other thing that winds up happening is anytime that there's sort of a license involved, and this includes any kind of, whether it's internal, whether it's externalized IP, same thing goes for movie license games, Dora the Explorer game, whatever it is. There's some built-in audience, and it's a very different design space to try to figure out how do we appeal to that audience in a way that like we know who they are, we know things about them, which is a very different space than like the first Halo or the first Zelda or the first thing. They're always kind of these like big gambles in the dark of like we hope one of these weird projects pays off, because most totally original things don't, and then wind up like losing the money you hope you make back from the hits as part of the dynamic of how the industry works. And so by the time that they are on the 4th, 5th edition, whatever, oftentimes like people who worked on the original, a lot of them have moved on with their lives. They don't want to work on Halo 5 either. They don't work on Halo 4 either. Like they've gone into other games, or they've sold their company, or they're somewhere else in life. And so it becomes, at this point, someone else's kind of responsibility to shepherd it. And this is something that, like from the outside, before I worked alongside people who were working on Command & Conquer or other kind of games I loved as a kid, I was kind of weirded out about like, oh, do they sell out? Do they get acquired by this other company, whatever? And what I realized was like, if they didn't hand off that trademarked intellectual property, it would have just ceased to exist because they got tired of working on it. Like, and so I'm glad someone else is carrying the torch so it can continue to reach people in whatever form it takes. The other thing goes on, you mentioned like, okay, multiplayer is amazing, single player less so, is that the dynamics of how games get paid for changes dramatically over time. I mean, when I was a kid, like I would still put quarters in machines to play games. And so those games were incredibly hard because they're trying to get more quarters out of me. At some point, not too long after that, those kind of games didn't sell well on console because you could rent it for 2 days from Liberty Video or Blockbuster, see everything Space had to show you, or everything Space Invaders had to show you, not bother to buy it for $60. So you started getting longer story games where like they need to sell you something you can't just rent for 2 days and be done with. Obviously, in-app microtransactions, DLC, etc., like open betas, these things change the dynamics of the kind of games that work. And oftentimes now, like multiplayer is where there's a lot more consistent community, there's more kind of an event, there's more of a moment, streamers make it really popular. And so a lot of times those funds that used to be allocated to an epic single player experience, like broadband's at a point now where might strategically and maybe wisely allocate that to a multiplayer if that's like where they think most of the people are these days. So, like I said, it's difficult decisions, and I don't know if there's an easy answer to it. Lots of smart people are doing their best. It's hard.
You had a question, and then Miss Franklin was nice enough to get us some pizzas and some soda. Thank you for coming, and why don't we just take this question and then get something to eat? Sound good, Miss Franklin?
Yeah, sure. Just a few, because I don't want to stop the flow.
We got the flow.
Hello, Chris.
There's a lot
My
more.
name is Julius. I have a question about
Sure.
your company.
Okay,
You have a company.
I do.
What is the name of your company?
My company is GamKedo, G-A-M-K-E-D-O. It's actually more of a training and practice group at this point. I occasionally still do contract work where the past few years I've made a couple of games for pay, but that's not my main business I'm in anymore.
Okay.
Yep.
Can you talk to us about starting a company?
Totally.
That's where we're going now.
Yeah,
I thought
yeah.
that'd be a good part 2
Yeah.
of this.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll get to that.
Oh, yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. That's where we're going.
Absolutely. You look so excited.
Yes, both of you, what is your favorite 3 games?
Aha.
Oh, I am terrible at video games, but I would say of all time, oh man,
Don't say 2K.
NHL Hockey 1996. I'll beat the hell out of any of you. I am that good at that game.
Oh, what you mean?
It's but you guys
See
will
me
go
in 2K,
down.
I'll take you on.
Sega, he will. Sega Genesis 1996. NBA Live 2003. Was
You know,
incredibly
I'll still
incredible.
take your ankles.
No, that one I'll destroy you. It'll be
I'll
over.
dunk
There'll be
you.
blood on the floor. And then what was that game? Streets of Rage 2.
Oh my
I kill anyone. That's only because I'm good. Yes, sir.
You guys played the Warriors?
Oh, wait, you didn't get my
Oh.
game.
Oh yeah, no,
Other games.
I definitely. So
Alright.
this is the video that matters. I don't know what I'm talking about.
Well, okay. Well, so one thing is, I still play modern games. I recently finished the Modern Prey. I played all the way through GTA 5. I played all the way through Dishonored 2. I still play and beat modern games. So lately, I've been enjoying Crossout. But like the classic games that I like the most, as design examples of things I keep going back to in my life, Bubble Bobble from 1986 by Taito. It's 2 little dinosaurs who like bubble the monsters. It's not the one with the like snood kind of bubble bouncing. That one's supposed to move. Bubble Bobble's got the little dinos. I was a big fan of GoldenEye 64 on Nintendo 64. That I think was a landmark of
Is that a
bubble
religion,
design.
more or less?
Well, and that one's like there's a whole bunch of really interesting stories about the design of that game in terms of like Marty Hollis, the producer from the game's come out with all kinds of interviews about very unusual process that better maps to the kind of games processes we use in our clubs. And then third, I'm tempted to list something more. I'm going to say Terminator 2: The Pinball Machine instead.
Oh, wow.
My graduate thesis was actually had to do with the relationship between the pinball industry and digital games, because there's a lot of carryover overlap of the companies, the designers, the design dynamics. A lot of academics study games from like a board game perspective. I come at it more from like high scores, extra lives, reactions, reflexes, which came out of pinball rather than board game history.
So why don't you get something to eat? I definitely want to hear your question,
Have you
though.
played Spiral?
Oh, wow.
I have not played Spyro.
What about San Andreas?
Oh yeah, I played Sandra, yeah.
Ratchet and Clank.
Played some Ratchet and Clank,
That's
yep.
the game.
Finished them. Those are all good
Those
games.
3 games is the game.
We all play San Andreas.
Yeah.
That's the game.
I feel like when I'm driving down the street, I'm like, I'm in San Andreas. It just looks like a video game. All right, why don't you get something to eat, and then we'll continue.
Let's start with one.
Sorry.
They're actually
No, it's great.
Dinner. Yeah, you're awesome. It's so good.
I'm having a good time.
Is that the game you've been making?
These are all games I made. Those are the first 3 games I made. This is in chronological order, so we go into some other stuff.
Why don't you go ahead and start again?
Okay, great.
Sure.
All right. Welcome back to part 2. So, I think what we've learned so far is that when you are killing many people on screen or doing a great job with Draymond Green or anything in 2K, how much goes into that behind the scenes just to make sure you can shoot a guy appropriately in the face, you know? So it's good to consider next time you're playing. Now, going forward, can you tell, I want to get into your company that you started, but before that, can you tell us about the overall kind of how does the video game industry work? You know, I know that's a big question, but I'm curious about just the business sense of.
Sure,
You know, we might not know anything.
All right, let me pause this so it's not a distraction. Those were all games I'd worked on.
You give us the political answer and then the real answer if you want.
Sure. So, and actually, let's double check that my redundant recording's still going, and it is. Cool. All right. So one thing about the game industry is that it is dovetailed, which is to say there's a lot of things we could look at and call the game industry. When I was in Atlanta, there were different kind of companies that would go to. There's a conference out there called Siege that included gambling companies that built like slot machine software. That's game industry. And to some people, they hear that and they're like, oh, gaming industry, they assume you're working on like casino products. There's game industry that's completely shoestring budget, garage developers, you know, they have some completely unrelated full-time day job, and then there's making games, that's game industry. And there's also these enormous companies that year after year are cranking out the next sports game that like they've figured out, we have an audience, we have a license, we have a trademark, we have control of this property, we're going to keep trying to impress fans of Madden or whatever, incrementally as best they can. And that's obviously, that's game industry too, despite being, that's like a multi-billion-dollar a year business. So it super varies. It exists also because it's kind of like, it'd be like asking like book industry. Mm-hmm. It's like, well, there's textbooks, and there's like self-help books, and there's philosophy, and there's fiction, and games are all over the place in terms of style, what goes into them, scale, cost, all those kind of things. So it does get kind of a little more specific about, I mean, somewhere in Japan, some companies are like still producing some arcade type machines. Like we don't see much of that in the US, that's still going on too. And that's a very different kind of business with electrical engineers involved in a way that like most software companies don't hire for, you know, making sure you can't rip the steering wheel off the thing. So that's a thing.
Okay. So tell us about how you went from working at all the major game companies to how you even got the idea to start your own
Sure.
business.
Yeah. And so like I said, this is something where so every path I'd started down on life, part of the tricks I'd always use to talk to someone else who had been there longer, further down the same road I was on. I did this in grad school, I did this in EA, did this in the startup scene, did this in starting my first company, everything I've been, I would find other people who'd been on that track much longer and ask them like, okay, I know there's pros to this, but like what are the cons that people don't talk about? What are the trade-offs that you made for this path in life? What are the things you liked that you didn't expect? What are the things you disliked you didn't expect? Because I knew my life might have some parallels to that if I stayed on that course. And I think part of what I started to see at the giant companies, and again, I never want to sound like I'm saying that there's anything wrong with it. Like some people really love working there, they find it really satisfying, they work with some of those talented people in the world, they produce products that everyone's heard of, and like that's great. And still, it's kind of like, even though I've made 100 games in the past 20 years, the handful that most people in the crowd will care about are like the enormous ones I worked on with the giant company. But when I would meet with some of the more senior people who've been there for decades, and I'd realize like they would have like models on their desk and decorating their office because like that was their creative outlet. Because it didn't actually come anymore from like being a part of this enormous process with so many moving parts, so many team members. Everything to get into the game was like a bit of like a political maneuvering fight to like prove the concept, make a case for it, keep getting pushed down, keep trying again. And I was just like, I just like being on smaller projects. And like, even if fewer people haven't played them, even if more, it doesn't have the same reach or name recognition, I was like, if I can make it work, but still be building smaller things, like that's just where I'm happier. That's the kind of thing I like to do. That's my niche. And there's people who love to be in a symphony or a marching band. There's people who want to be in like a garage band. And like, different strokes, different folks. And so that was part of it for me, navigated me first from enormous company to startup scene, where I was at a 5-person company. And that was something where it certainly, like, I liked that when I looked around, there were like 5 or 6 people, and like I knew why Dave was there, and I knew what John did, I knew what Mathilde did. Versus like in an enormous company, I was like, I don't know what the 4th floor does. I don't know what anyone over there, like there's like art happening, but like I can't tell one of them from the others, like who's an animator, who's the hands guy, who's the face guy, I don't know. And I like that smaller setting. And I'll also say like those kind of trade-offs came obviously with like trade-offs of stability versus risk. And these are oftentimes in career path choices. Things where like I was making a steadier paycheck with a larger company than when I went to a startup scene, like involved a pay cut from what I was able to make at a larger, reliably branded, established software company into like a small business where it's like, we hope this works. If it does, we all might do very well. If it doesn't, we're going to have basically earned 25% of what we could have for 3-4 years of our life. And somewhere in the middle is also entirely possible, but nobody knows. And like that's the nature of small business. And I think I found that very exciting. I found that very enjoyable. In that case, we were actually building at that first startup company was a web game creating tool. So I always liked helping people get into making games. Same reason I'm here. This has been one of my life missions, is getting more people doing this because it's been such a wonderful part of my life. And it was called playcrafter.com, and you could like drag and drop these characters, and you could like put a turret here and add some text and make a little platformer character and recolor it and tell a story in your game. And we had like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of games made by like largely teenagers, kids, people around the country, around the world, just building games online. They could play online, share, comment on each other's stuff. And that was a case where like I found that really satisfying. I loved that, and I loved all the people I was working with, and I really felt grateful to be there. But Silicon Valley, outside funding, reality of things, and I had already left the company by the time this happened, so this is not insider knowledge or anything I had. It was like, at the scale of business that worked at was not the kind of thing that investors feel like they're getting explosive growth out of. Because the way that startups work is like investors, outside company, people who are sitting on money, try to funnel money into it, say, make a money-making machine that returns as much as we can on our investment. And so at that point, the company had to kind of pivot into doing other things that like were different kind of games than the games I liked, that weren't the kind of games I wanted to work on, that felt less creatively satisfying to me, less like I was able to help people build games by building a community. So like eventually that online building games thing had to shut down, and they had to instead work on building a different kind of games that weren't my kind of games. It was like Facebook games, which there's nothing wrong with, it's just not my kind of games. But to the investors met the need, but like weren't what I wanted out of it. And so again, I kind of kept searching for, okay, well, I understand now that if there's outside capital, obviously there's stability that comes from it, but there's also this risk of you're not in total control of it. And that's where all my companies ever since have been completely bootstrapped, of trying to make it work on as little money as possible, trying to like be in positive earnings from day one, of like, I'm not going to spend anything on marketing, spend anything on whatever, unless it's coming from customers I have paying me on some sort of basis that I know I can reinvest back into the company because it's money that I'm not going into debt on. Or losing control over, or being at the whims of someone else having to turn some dial to say like, yeah, that's kind of working, but we think this will work more better, and we're paying for this, so this is what you have to do. And that for me was where, okay, I'm going to try this entrepreneurship thing.
Okay, so you went out and you tried your own thing, and now tell us about this company you've come up with here.
Sure. Well, so the current company, and I'll build it kind of a bridge in the middle. Current company, Gamketo, it's focused on game development training. It helps people into it. I have a free course on Udemy, udemy.com, called Code Your First Game. 90,000 people have taken that.
Wow.
That feeds in the top of a funnel where there's a paid course afterwards, which, by the way, if anyone here wants that course, I will ask Aaron afterward, whenever, and I will send him codes so you can just get that course for free. Don't pay for that course from here. You're here. I want to help you out. But that's been taken by about 4,000 people, and that follows like a textbook that I wrote, which is self-published. Again, didn't want a publisher, didn't want anyone else to have control over my stuff. So it comes with my like digital textbook, 550 pages, 6 game examples. And like those first kind of steps were kind of like training wheels, where like you're following recipes. It's like build this game, write these lines, here's how it works. And past a certain point, to stay engaged creatively, you have to start working on your own projects. You have to like care about what comes out of it. You can't just keep doing like on YouTube, I found how to build another thing like this, because a lot of the challenges that arise actually come out of navigating that like infinitely open-ended design space of I could do so many different things right now. how do I even size up what to do, why to do it? You run into problems where no one has the immediate answer. And part of programming, or any kind, whether game development or otherwise, is like ability to estimate how long is it going to take to solve this problem I've never run into before. And so those kind of come from open-ended projects, and so that's where I started Gam Keto Club, which is what the shirt's for, which is an online group of people around the world who build games together, and like I support and mentor them. So they're subscribing as members. I train if anyone on the teams gets stuck. I've worked on enough games in the background I can like help just teach with them right on the context of like, you're trying to solve this problem, you're stuck on it. Let's talk about 3 or 4 different ways we could solve this. Let's kind of walk through solving it if we need that. And it gives everyone else on the team the confidence that the games that we're going to get released. And so we've made 35 games in the past 2 years. And that's people all over the world working together online. But something that one of the things that chews up a lot of game developers that they will get themselves in a corner. Because again, programming involves like, I've never seen this problem before. Is it a 3-week problem? Is it a 3-hour problem? Occasionally we'll run up into this problem. It turns out like PhDs have wasted decades trying to solve it, and it turns out it's an unsolvable problem as far as we can tell. But they will just sort of go off the deep end of getting stuck in things, the game won't get finished, and that just kills morale. Because like the same excitement we have about like games are cool, I like games, I like making things, goes away if someone like creates art or music or programming functionality for a game that doesn't get released. Because now they feel kind of zapped of like, I put myself into this vessel, I left a part of myself in it, and like no one even gets to see it. And this is also one of these things that like when we talk about commercial game industry and at scale and the realities of the business, I have friends who worked on finished arcade machines that were never released. People who worked on finished console games that were never released because some top level person in the company looked at strategically like, we just don't think there's a market this year for dinosaur fighting. But we didn't know until it was too late, and so the cost benefit analysis, the trade-offs, return on investment, etc., the maintenance, whatever goes into these things, we're just gonna can that one and focus our energy on this thing. And that level, that's what they gotta do. But it results in people who have worked on projects that were canceled or otherwise. And again, like that's a reality of, okay, well that's because they're on the side of taking the bets on what ideas to work on and so on. And that is a reality that again, like in our practice settings, in our club settings, a lot of the kind of games you see are just built to people in those clubs. It's where like we know we can release this because we're spending nothing on it. There's nothing really at risk. It's all in our spare time, off hours, weekend hours, whatever. But it gives us total creative control over it because we're not at the mercy of some outside company who says like, for our yogurt game, for a solar panel game, needs to be this. Or someone thinks, well, for our game to be more commercially successful, needs in-app transactions or something else where people on the team may be like, but that's not the kind of game I feel like making. And so that's been a lot of what kind of business focused on. My first business before this one was largely, I was trying to think where I balanced contract game development, where people would pay me to build games for them, either publishers or individuals, where they have a game idea. They don't necessarily have the in-house strengths to manage that team or complete that project, but they want to take a bet on like, okay, well, for this amount of money, we expect the likelihood we're going to see a return on it is, X, Y, or Z. And so I would work out deals with publishers where like a 4-deal contract, 2 games are their design, 2 games are my design. We have 8 months on it. They pay me checks at 30% or 40% done. I guess they're 30, 60, and 100% done. It's kind of spreading out the cost. That was then my money to try to reallocate to paying animators, paying artists, paying sound people, because when you're selling a product, you're competing in a space where people have invested financially in those projects, and my earnings was whatever was left over from that. And that was some of my early experience with entrepreneurship, was realizing like there were months when I would do incredibly well, cashing a big check, and then see no income for like 8 months. And that was this sort of like trade-off of like, all right, well, this is how this part of life works. It's not a steady paycheck. There's no one making sure I'm consistently seeing X amount of money per month, and kind of help train me. And like when I have a great month, even with my current business, I don't get too hyper excited. I don't start planning around it because I know it's going to help offset hopefully the weak months, which will happen too. And likewise, I know not get too depressed when there's like a rocky period because, okay, good, I squirreled some away when I had a good month and I didn't get ahead of myself in spending or whatever. And so that, but basically I was trying to do a contract stuff on the side, and that was so much more steadily paying than trying to grow my own side things, that like my business kind of got eaten up by that. It kind of got consumed by that. The same way as, we talk about like the investors would be like, well, the company will make money if it does this. Even if it's your own money, you start to run into these problems of like, but like I need to make steady money, and it's very tempting to do the things that pay better but involve different trade-offs. And so at that point I sort of rebooted my life a little bit, went back to school for a few more years. And this is after I'd been in industry for a while, done some stuff, but I was like, I need to try to pivot my identity, need to explore some different things, need to get caught up on what's being discussed in different ways. Went to school for a couple more years, and it was during that time when I felt like I had a little more wiggle room to kind of like try, okay, different styles of teaching, different types of helping people out or whatever. During that time, I volunteered on weekends for 8 months, teaching game programming just to people locally, just to like get practice teaching. And that was, I just wanted experience trying to pass these things on that I felt like I'd spent so many years accumulating. further developing that's actually what became that free video course. That material that I was volunteering with on weekends of like just trying to get it out there and help people. And so again, it was a case where like at the time what I was doing, like it didn't pay me anything. It clearly didn't scale because it was like me sitting in a room with like 3 or 4 people at a time. But turned into something that did scale in a way that part of what sets my video course apart from a lot of other courses that are out there is like during the thing I'm explaining answers to questions that real human beings asked when I was walking them through this. A lot of things on YouTube or otherwise are somebody who's like just kind of for the first time spitting it out as they go through this thing that they've never taught before, and just working with people through the material. There's some time in the middle I did some private training, kind of further refining the material, but it was like the thing that didn't scale helped me develop a thing that did in a way that now I'm really grateful I can help so many more people. Like 2/3 of the people in my courses are outside the US. I'm still every single day logging in and answering questions people post on the course of like, hey, my Pong kind of battle of like the balls and the paddles, like the ball's not showing up, what's the deal? And I'll help them troubleshoot their code. And I actually am really grateful that like lots of names are like foreign names I can't pronounce or have never seen before. And I'm just like really grateful that the internet exists in a way that like I can help and reach people that I would never meet, I will never know, they will probably never be a paid customer of mine in any capacity, but like that's not the point. I'm doing the paid stuff because it allows me the wiggle room to like focus, it increases the quality of the stuff I can give away, or increases the scale at which I can give away lower things or make the text more accessible, etc.
So a lot of the people here are interested, I think, in potentially making your own games. And a big thing that you said, which I thought was fascinating, and no one's ever said this before, is you can do this and you don't need a bunch of fancy equipment or tons of years of training in computer programming. How do you go about that? Maybe you want to show us something?
Sure,
I leave
yeah.
it to you.
Sure. Yeah, so again, I'll play this video a little bit just because this is an example of the kind of games I was building growing up. And this is, again, like when we think about, oh, games that I love don't include these kind of games. Like, they're just not as impressive. And I might think of this, too, as like, if you're first starting to play music, you're going to play Marietta Little Lamb on a recorder or guitar or whatever. Like, it's not going to be fancy at first. And so the stuff we started with was very much literally, there's my Snake, there's my Pong knockoff, there's my Breakout knockoff. And it's like when you're trying to learn an instrument, you don't compose music at the same time. You learn how to like get this note to follow that note and get it to sound right. Little Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, little racing game, Q-Bird knockoff, Pac-Man knockoff. And it really was just, this is my little like firefighter game with one of my first original designs. Gideon is another original design, terrible, not fun. Knockoff of Ack Attack, knockoff of a space game. And like, I just sort of, but like this was, I had no resources. I was on a basic home computer. There's no like special equipment involved. There was no special software involved. Once you kind of know on a computer like where you can type things and save things and run things, especially on a modern machine as opposed to like this time in the 90s, you can just run code on a computer, like a standard home computer. And build, so this is, I rebuilt, so a lot of my practice again is cloning games. I specifically ripped the graphics out of Bubble Bobble and tried to figure out like, okay, how do the bubbles move? How do the monsters move? And I reprogrammed that. And you'll see another example later. I rebuilt part of GoldenEye 64 to like just study its movement and mechanics. By this point, I was hoping to, these are some bigger games, and some little martial arts stuff. And so actually this game here with like these little these arrows and the ball bouncing was actually based on like how the bubbles move in Bubble Bobble. Where each time I do one of these projects, I'm kind of like borrowing some things, picking up some new concepts, some new ideas. This RPG we made was terrible. RPGs are really hard to make with like no money and no time and no people. There was like the only fight is rock, paper, scissors in the whole game. Seriously, that's it. Made a skiing game. And just kind of like, and then at this point, we're starting to see club projects where this is now like a collaborative effort of maybe 4 to 8 to 12 people. This actually, one of these games actually did really well in Linux. This game was, so Battleship 88 was one of my first huge online games, played by 50,000 people, disproportionately in Czech Republic and Brazil, for reasons that like we have never understood why. But part of what's cool about computer stuff is like you can put metrics in things and find out who's playing this, where in the world, how long is spending on it, that kind of stuff. Made an Advance Wars knockoff with like designed our own units for it. But, it's just like, too, again, I use a million metaphors of like playing music or like cooking food or whatever, is the idea that like each time you get better at it, you can kind of riff a little more, have your own personal style, try this spice and that spice, cook a little bit longer, and kind of start to, through that format, get a little more wiggle room in the kind of, so this is when I worked on Boom Blocks and Medal of Honor Airborne at EA. Boom Blocks is kind of like a 3D Angry Birds-ish, about a 90-person team. And I actually love that because they're the levels were like one-person jobs, just like designing these levels. So I got to like make Guerrilla. This is Jenny Land. I made the game in 3 days. It's kind of a throwaway concept. So these are the games I worked on. This is the startup. That's the solar panel selling game I worked on, advertising game. Oh, so these things, for 219 days in a row, I built a little experimental gameplay project alone. 7 months of this stuff, which is bizarre and not a usual thing to do, but allowed me to get very, very like exploratory in terms of just weird stuff. And some of my first successful iPhone apps were actually versions of things I built through that experimental sequence. This is Topple. This game was very successful on iPhone for the publisher, a little bit less so for me, but it helped me land my next work, and that's often a trade-off you find early in a career. What'd you say? Yeah, I was a co-developer for Topple. Nice.
Wow.
Yeah, it used to be on, humble brag, it used to be on 1 in 5 iPhones, but that's not me, that was the publisher. So this is Alice in Bomberland. That was one of the games I loved working on with the publisher. That was one of my ideas. So at this part I started to get weird and artsy games. This is like Transcendence based on Walden by Thoreau. I've got this other game that's kind of about like relationships or something weird. Weird phase of my life, but like experimental. That's also when I got involved with IndieCade. You know, and I got like this weird thing with the lines here. That was number 5 on iPad in entertainment, because weirdness.
Wow.
But like it was just continuously just like there's people who like, oh, I'm a dancer, I dance, and if no one's gonna pay me to dance, I'm gonna dance anyway. That's been me with game development. Of like I'm gonna make games. And so we made some like different little art stuff. If I'm in a class, I find a way, can I make a game for this project? This based on Andy Warhol's art and the other thing. So this game is actually incredible. This is 7 million plays worldwide, about half in China. But this game was free, so it's not like we made any money off of it. But this was a project by some students who, this is actually a lot of what I talk about in my process stuff. The first version of this game came out of a class project where they had like 4 weeks to just do a thing. And I didn't work on that game. But that game did well enough in terms of people liked it that they spent energy on making a sequel. I worked on the sequel. Sequel did well, so that helped us decide to ramp up the team even more for a third game. And it's kind of like how at a big company they'll have like alphas and betas. They're trying to investigate like how much more energy to invest in this, what's broken, what can we improve about it. But each time we made kind of a bigger version, we took kind of a longer arc, a bigger project out of it. These are some more club projects. I started the club when I was in grad school. I started another club like the one when I was an undergrad. And so these are things where like what I like about these projects is I could dip in there and like make levels for a game, do sounds for a game, do programming for one game, do little bits and pieces. Did all the art for this one were like seasons of trees and stuff. And again, it's not like fancy or amazing stuff, but it was like we knew everyone who worked on it. And you can point to it and be like, I did that character. That was my idea. I built this level. And there's this different kind of ownership and satisfaction that comes out of it. For some people, and so this game, so we passed it very quickly. That's fine. Occasionally, this is when I rebuilt GoldenEye stuff.
Oh, awesome.
And I literally used assets ripped out of the memory from like a ROM of it, and rebuilt the UI. You can see I'm walking on water because whatever. This is a Connect game we built in research to try to like have it interpret your gestures, so it can tell you if you're punching or whatever. This is a grocery game. That's actually my fiance. We're getting married in a month. That's her in the top. That's me below. We're doing co-op grocery shopping. That was a little project we did together. Right? This is like a little experimental thing for a class. This is another. This is when I started my online club. This dinosaur game was pretty, really happy that came out. But by this point, a lot of these projects these are games specifically from the current club that people just build together. We started as LA Local, and we turned online for sort of a whole separate side story of how we got there. I can go into if someone's curious. We did a little VR stuff. So this game was like little crummy arcade games. You could walk around and play them in the game, which is just fun making those. We have a picnic packing game. We have a game about learning math. And again, because like we don't have to justify a market need for this. We don't have to make a business case around it. We're just building this thing for practice, learn some stuff, have some fun. This is I proposed with a game because I'm me. So that was my 100th game, and that's still what we're up to today. Is like that we're still building these games. Just had another release like last Sunday. Have another release in a month. But yeah, I mean, so again, like there's like a pocket in the middle of these where I was doing them professionally, but a lot of them have been whatever else is going on in my life. I'm building games, and that's something that like. Didn't need a big budget, didn't need a bunch of time from people. If we go to, I'm assuming I probably don't have internet, right? I didn't count on it, but just a sec. Okay, no, which is fine. I don't actually need it. But yeah, so that is where, I guess I can actually pull up the course thing. When this video was made, it was 60K instead of 90. But yeah, codeyourfirstgame.com is the free course. And again, if you want to take the course that follows it, let Aaron know and I will send him via you codes for it. But it really tries to recreate like the same sort of sequence I started with. You're building some of these classic kind of games. Like the first course it looks like Pong, but it's kind of a old pattern. Then the follow-up course has this kind of breakout style looking game and this kind of overhead racing thing. And it's really just kind of like those games. It's less about the actual game, and it's more about I talk about how like in woodshop, like everybody in woodshop. We learned to use a lathe by building a gavel. We learned to use a router by like maybe working on a frame or a box or whatever. We learned joinery through building a birdhouse. And like each of these games, when we do them, we're doing them just to like practice different concepts like motion, like text on the screen, collisions for a grid, like the way these things work out. Just kind of how we use them as stepping stones towards filling people with concepts and stuff. I probably deviated a bit from the question, but
No, I mean, no, but, oh, yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
You said that the course is supposed to go through like the steps that you took to learn game development. Does that mean, because you said that you started off, you didn't have like a game engine, and then you start off with just bare code?
So yeah, so this was the computer I did it on. It was 100 megahertz Pentium with 8 megabits of RAM. It involved assembly routines to plot pixels and to play tones from the computer sound. I don't encourage doing that because computers were awful in the late 90s. Yeah, so now I teach the same concepts, but that's where I say I use JavaScript instead. More modern, HTML5 compliant, Canvas language. We use it in a format that, because I professionally use like 6 different languages, Objective-C, C#, C++, C, ActionScript 3, etc. The part of JavaScript I teach from is the overlap, kind of the Venn diagram of like reusable concepts that also apply in these other languages. Because I know most people's first programming language is not their last one, it's like a springboard to others. And so I just teach very, very straightforward patterns of like functions, variables, built-in stuff. I do it all in vanilla JavaScript. There's ways that, like, if my goal was to build a more sophisticated game, people build helper libraries to do sophisticated things like make particle effects pop out or play sounds in really dynamic ways. When I'm teaching beginning steps, we don't use any of that stuff because we focus on like learn to do it yourself. Because like even if it's crummy and slow and not as fancy, having to like make your own rectangle functions and make your own whatever, you learn some things that are useful building blocks.
And do you eventually teach people how to use tools like Unity?
In the club, we use this as a springboard into Unity projects with C#.
Okay, cool.
Oh, yes, sir.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Flowers, one of the instructors here.
Oh, okay.
I've had most of these students at one time or another. So let me ask you a question. You mentioned in your background that you had computer science.
Mm-hmm.
So I did too,
Nice.
around the same time. So I know it's kind of what the challenges are to get through that. If I'm a student sitting in the audience, I'm not quite sure if I want to pursue a 4-year degree. How does math play an important part in solving problems on a daily basis?
I'm glad you asked. Yeah, so well, there's 2 things I think that are worth noting. There's math in relation to computer science, and there's math in relation to game programming, and they obviously overlap some. But like a lot of the math we did in computer science, so here's like, and I don't want to sound like I'm not bashing this. Like calculus. And more advanced calculus was hard for me. I was like whatever it is about what makes calculus good for some people was like, that's not my strength. I struggled a bit in Calc 2 or whatever. Same thing for statistics, where I was like, I know it's valuable. I know it's super important. I respect people who are actuaries, but like, this is not where my headspace is. But like computer science math was actually much easier for me. It's discrete mathematics. It's a different field than calculus, than statistics. Like sometimes there's some overlap in combinatorics and stuff, but it's different kinds of math. And as much as like algebra and trig and geometry like have different kinds of puzzles, different kinds of ways of thinking, had a lot more in common with geometry proofs in a lot of cases. Of a lot of the kind of things we deal with in math and computer science was like, okay, if I run this computation, will it ever complete? Can we prove that it will or won't? And those things come up in sometimes in computer game programming where it's like, okay, if we have networking problems and someone disconnects and they're all kind of linked together, how long does it take to reroute a connection? And can we count on it happening in under 1/60th of a second? Can we count on it happening with certain reliability? And certain time bound. So those things come up in game programming. The other thing that I really like about of math in game programming specifically, even differently than computer science classes, was that it gave me incredibly practical grounding in like using trigonometry and geometry. Where when we were in classes in like, there were triangles and they're talking about like solving for X and like, that's just like, I wasn't drawn to those things. Somebody, that's their jams. I did not really like, I can't wait to do this. I didn't understand. But when I was working on games, like that's how my car could drive diagonally using sine and cosine. Like that's how my gun could shoot at an angle. That's how like I could plot a circle of fire around someone casting a spell using sine and cosine. And you just get a much more practical grounding in like you're having to type these worlds into existence. And math is really good for describing spatial relationships to one another, things in different relative positions. I mean, my dad, it's like my dad's a smart guy. He's been managing a whole region of like electrical distributors for whole career, but he was like, Chris, why do people use the distance formula? And like he's a very smart guy. And I was like, I use it to pick up power-ups and to tell if a good guy's bumping into the enemy ship. Like that's what I use it for. I don't know what he would use it for, but like that's why I need that. And it actually turns out there's like a bizarre whole weird category of like interestingly different versions of collision code based on the needs for like, man, that Battleship game, like it's an isometric view of 3D ships. There it is. like to tell if these two ships are colliding with each other involved figuring out the math stuff for if two rotated rectangles overlap. And like writing code to compute, do these two rotated rectangles overlap from an isometrically bent perspective? And if I didn't have that, then the game wouldn't be as good, because like ships that shouldn't have hit will hit. And I had this very actual need for like, okay, I want the cannon to go underwater where the person clicks to fire their naval cannon. That was a little bit of an algebra problem to solve of like intercept for a certain range and velocity and whatever. And that was completely grounded in like what I could do and what I wanted my game to do. The gap was like, gotta figure out some math stuff. And when I'm training people now in game programming, oftentimes they're like, oh, I'm like having to relearn, even though they went through trig, they even maybe got okay grades, having to kind of relearn it for like applying it. Because it's just a very different grounded, totally different way of thinking about it. To like, there's a problem I need to solve, and if I'm comfortable with these, I can pull kind of weird tricks out and do things very efficiently and very quickly. And the other thing is, well, sometimes might be some sort of kludge or really brute force workaround if somebody finds some way to pull it off. But you look at their code, and these are the kind of things that they want to find out in interviews. You'd be like, oh man, if you were just aware of like vectors, you could have done this in like 3 lines instead of like spending a day doing it. And so it makes a difference in interviews if someone can like fluently speak to like, okay, here's why this is a better way to solve this problem this way instead of that way, even if the two would give us the same result. Those kind of things. Likewise for like matrices in math. And this is again, like I asked, so matrices are used for a ton of 3D stuff. They're used for rotations, they're used for scale, they're used for like, if you ever see called kinematics or inverse kinematics, like in a Madden game, I'm not a sports person, it's going very fast. The person catching the ball, like to make their hands go where the ball's going, involves this like sequence of joints that rotate, and solving for that dynamically in a way that like goes with the animation is extremely complicated, but uses a series of layered matrix math to multiply like these rotations by those rotations by this position. And I asked him like, hey, the kind of matrix stuff we're doing in this college level matrix course, do you have some examples of how we could use this in computer graphics or game programming or whatever? And he had like never even occurred to him that like you could apply these things for that. Like he teaches very abstract theoretical stuff, which there's uses for in astronomy and other kinds of things. But it's like even though he was like an expert in that field and a professor for life in it, just hadn't realized like these are really useful and necessary for us in 3D graphics or in shape manipulations and stuff in ways that I'm not sure if people are familiar with Unity. It's a 3D engine, freely available on the internet, really high quality, great engine to use. But like people who know those sort of math and things can get their games to do things that nobody else can. That like their game has like the ground warp under an earthquake or something. Anyway, someone else just has no idea how to get it to do that. And the answer is they did a whole bunch of math that like to them seems like, well, we used to have to do this. So now we still kind of know how. That's also part of why for the approach I teach, we don't start with the kind of engines or libraries, is to try to build those foundations for, oh yeah, here's an example of like, let me see here, I even stuck the animation here from, all right, so this car is going to drive 10 units east, or its speed is like, X speed is 10, vroom. And then it's going to drive north, Y speed is 10, so 1 second or 1 frame later at 90-degree angle, going up by 10. And so there's this question of, if I'm driving at 45 degrees, I don't go 10 over and 10 up. I'm not 10 on both. That's where like I need sine and cosine to figure out that I need to go like 70.7% as far on each axis. And like these things just become a very different way of thinking about the numbers in terms of, again, I need my cars to do something when they collide. And there's like this infinitely deep rabbit hole of when I was on the middle of honor team, there were guys who were coding like the shock spring suspension for a Jeep going over stuff. And like there is a lot of complexity to like, Hooke's law is like literally a spring thing, but then games often at that level run at variable frame rates, which means like, so in like simple games we do in our own time, we might say this game runs 20 times a second, this logic runs 30 times a second, like a cartoon. Between frames, it's doing some calculations. At commercial grade scale, frame rate's often variable. That's like it's 60 when they can do it. Sometimes it's 45 if there's a lot of stuff happening on the screen. There's a bit of range in there or whatever. And so solving for that spring constant in a way that no matter whether you have 45 calculations or 60 is the same end result after like 10 seconds of it involves calculus to figure out like how to make those numbers not compound in an ugly or unpredictable way so someone with a low frame rate doesn't have a bad result versus a good frame rate. So yeah, tons of it in game programming, even more so than computer science in general. But the part I liked actually about computer science was that it was a kind of a different kind of math, where it was like it wasn't the same as the math that I kind of struggled in, I guess.
Do you think that having the math background helped you with logic in general, solving problems?
I definitely think so. I think so. It's like a bit of a spatial sense. So often what's happening, again, like especially in a lot of programming, like we're having to visualize something and type our way through it. And I think math forces us to become much more aware of spatial relationships of things in a way that oftentimes we're trying to, I mean, I guess part of like the computer science math approach to things is we're often trying to like fit one problem to another problem we've solved. Because one way we can answer that question of like, is this even computable ever? Is like, okay, well, if I can prove that this problem is actually like another version of this other problem we have an answer to, then yes, it's exactly the same complexity as that problem. A lot of game programming involves like, okay, if I can picture other problems I've solved that are like this, I have a lot more options at my disposal for, like I say, I might be able to do it faster, might be able to do it more fancy. I mean, again, so even like there's a side effects of like when someone's new to making a particle explosion, where two things collide, a firework or missile goes off, whatever, and there's just, it wants to send stuff everywhere, sparks and stuff. If you're not using trigonometry to do it or vector math, then you get a box explosion. Square explosion. You know, that's not right. And the only way to a circular explosion is to either learn vector math or trigonometry, and to be aware that those are tools at your disposal. There's also a degree to which even like in an engine like Unity, so quaternions are this much more advanced math concept that like I'm not sure I have a total handle on. Like it's kind of like a little more sophisticated than matrix math. But a lot of programming in Unity is like, okay, I don't actually have to know how to calculate it by hand with quaternions. I just have to know when I need to ask a quaternion to like, oh, this is a quaternion problem. I need this object to point to that object with the following up vector is like my solution to don't let the car flip over. But I have to understand like that's a problem that quaternions help me solve. And that kind of thing comes out of just like having to add exposure with it, experimented with it, run into similar kind of problems before.
So going forward, if they wanted to start like maybe even on their own or as a team, maybe make one game, I don't know, up to you guys, what would be the first step?
Sure. So again, so that's, and I say it not to like push my stuff, but because like, you know, this is the path that I built for people in our club we train. It's codeyourfirstgame.com. Thank you for coming, man. And that literally just goes through like the basics of like you get motion, you get mouse input, you get numbers on the screen. Because until you can do those things, you can't do anything. Once you can do those, you can kind of do a lot of things in 2D. It might be white boxes, but you can like do stuff. And so getting through those just as first projects, I will also encourage in doing team projects. One of the counterintuitive things that affects software industry in general, I think Peter Brooks' book, Mythical Man Month, addresses that like there's this counterintuitive idea that like in skyscraper construction, if we put twice the number of people in the problem, it'll be done in half the time. Like that's the reality of like construction human hours of effort. In software engineering, because so much of it's abstract and there's so many different differences in how we can style and structure things, larger teams slow things down enormously. It might make things different or like different things possible, but like 10 programmers aren't done 10 times as fast as one. It might take them 10 times as long. They might be able to do something fancier with it, but there's all these extra layers of like you have to like document the heck out of everything, have communication meetings, past 6 people, you need some sort of middle management layer to help produce their task and where the energy is being spent, make sure they're not stepping on each other's toes, and it just changes fundamentally. So one of the problems that when I'll speak to college clubs, sometimes they have like, okay, we have 30 people on a game, is that enough? And I'm like, that is so too many. Like if you had 10 teams of 3, 8 of those will finish. If you have one team of 30, 0 game is getting built.
Gotcha.
And that's just like when one person can like be the main person programming for a project and someone else is helping out with some art or music or sound or levels or something else, you can get away with all kinds of bizarre, ugly hackiness that like in a team setting would be completely inappropriate because like other people can't read that, can't follow the logic. You'd have to take your time to go back and refactor and clean it up and document it, which are skills worth developing if you want to work at a big company, because you don't want to go to the interview and be like, oh yeah, look at this thing I hack out, that's unreadable. But it is something that is a starting point for a smaller team is the kind of compromises we make for like, you know, if you're not engineer 180 on a team of 200, you don't get the same luxuries of like, I'm going to spend 3 weeks and do this the really fancy way because my only problem is to solve this problem in the perfectly correct, scalable, robust way. It becomes this like, all right, well, I can fit in 3 features this week or 1, depending on how I go about doing it. And you kind of start to figure out what corners can I get away with cutting that don't come back to bite me. Yeah.
And I'll ask one more question and open it up to Q&A, just anything you want. You mentioned that there's some entry-level jobs or companies in the game industry that many people overlook.
Right. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
What
so,
is that all about?
Yeah, so this is one of these things where part of what happens is someone was looking for work in the game industry, and like the first thing that comes to mind is just like we asked, okay, what games do you like? And we're like, okay, well, Grand Theft Auto and Halo and, you know, Last of Us and whatever. So then we go look at their careers website and we're like, whoa, like they want a lot of experience. They want like 5 years in industry, 30 years in industry, whatever. Like, well, how do I get a job? The answer is like working in companies you haven't heard of. almost everyone who works at that scale, that's not their first gig. Like, they spent some years hustling either in their friend's studio, at a smaller company. There's all kinds of service agencies these days. When we're talking about like contract work, one version of contract work is like some company, like say a solar company, doesn't make games. They hire me to like, hey, Chris DeLeon, you the person, make this game. There's also contract houses where, especially like in VR right now, virtual reality, a lot of the companies, friends I have, they'll take contract work as an agency. There's like a dozen of them, 24 of them, whatever, where some other companies like, hey, we don't have the internal skill set for VR, but we want to like try a VR thing. We'll pay the 20 of you to do this. And like they'll use that to kind of fuel their small company's income while they try to, on the side, fit in when they can their experiments in their own IP, kind of swinging for the fences of like, well, we have control over it, we own it, it's our property, our trademarks, we hope it succeeds, we're not banking on the fact that it does or our lights go out in a month. So that's another thing of like contracting agencies where if you look at like, okay, well, instead of just asking who built Mass Effect, if you look at who built Mass Effect's DLC, because it's not necessarily the same team that built Mass Effect. And the cool thing about it, if you can find an in to one of those companies where like you're building the expansion pack or the port or the whatever, is like you have Mass Effect on your resume. Like that helps open other doors, even if you did the expansion pack not with the original team. Even if you did like the Unity, the port to mobile or the port to Apple TV or whatever, people are like, well, someone trusted you we've heard of. That gets you an in as heavily or maybe more so than like any particular other kind of background you could have. So again, and even then, there's intermediary steps there of like, okay, well, you look at their resumes, thinker, then they might say 1 to 2 years experience. Like, okay, I'm seeing. We look at another point in the middle of how do I fill that in, and that's where, depending on the company's size, the smaller company you're appealing to, the better chance they can like try to understand you as a person because they're not under the same tidal wave. At gargantuan companies, like they literally can just like throw out resumes immediately under a certain year of experience without a certain degree from a certain school because they're just drenched every day in resumes. And there's other companies that don't have that kind of attention. That like, if people apply, they're like, okay, well, let's size this person up. Let's see what they can do. Let's look at their work. Let's talk to them. Let's see, maybe this is a fit. We don't know. We were kind of desperate. We can't say that, but like we need people here. And like that's a lot of times people will get their year 2 experience at these companies like you haven't heard of. You might not know the game from it, but that's their stepping stone towards these other games where within a few years, they're somewhere else. And like, so the other thing that also comes out of this is like people talking about networking is a huge thing, and that's any game, any industry, not just games. That's literally humans hire humans, and when we can fulfill a role first with someone who like someone else in the company can vouch for, it saves a ton of like HR stress over like firing people's expensive, hiring people's expensive. If they don't fit the company culture, we don't know anything about them, whatever. But the thing about networking is, it is infinitely easier to network with someone before they're successful. If you hit them up after they're successful, man. They know you're after like their money or their connections or their fame or being able to say you shook their hand or whatever. But like I have a whole bunch of very high profile indie and AAA friends now because when I met them, we were all a bunch of scrappy kids who like hadn't done anything. But like 15 years have passed and their careers have like, they're now leads of major companies of games and things that and like when I have like a little podcast where I interview these people about like, how'd you get into your job? Because I try to share these kind of stories. And I can help those people because I'll be like, hey, good to haven't caught up in like 5-6 years. What are you doing? They're like, this. I'm like, impressive. Talk to us.
What's your podcast?
Gamketo.community. So same name, .community. Yeah, that'll also, and that there's 85 of those. And again, that's like, and part of the purpose of that podcast was like the interviews that we see on TV or in movies or in magazines are kind of like the same, like really, really incredible figures. It's like Jonathan Blow from the indie scene. It's Notch from Minecraft. It's Shigeru Miyamoto and like Ifune and these people, like they were like the lead for this game we all know. But it's a little bit like thinking like, oh, I want to get into movies. What will my life be like when I'm like Steven Spielberg? It's like most people won't be Steven Spielberg in the film industry. And like as long as you don't go in there with that expectation, then like you can understand, okay, what are the realities of this? And so the podcast, I specifically try to go out of my way for most of the interviews. Whereas people like you haven't necessarily heard of their game or their company or their studio or them. They're not like famous for having invented Mega Man or whatever. But like it's a real person's job. Like year after year they make money doing this. This is their income. They talk about the risks in it, talk about the trade-offs in it, talk about where they're living, talk about like the dynamics of the office. And these whole different areas of work exist that are, like I say, sometimes easier ends because they're kind of in our blind spots. People don't realize that like those are stepping stones that lead to the other things that they have heard of.
And should they research like gaming companies by looking at like the mobile game company? All those mobile games?
It varies, and this is something that a few things to consider. Like one, there is absolutely this case of like for first job, often it's like where can I get experience? I know people who like they did not like Zynga games, they found an opportunity to work at Zynga for a while. Now they're working at like Double Fine or somewhere like way cooler. But like that's because they helped tick that box for like 1-2 years experience, clocking in, professionally being responsible for programming and art and discussions about how to work with different kinds of people than ourselves. Which one of the things I like about games, by the way, both whether it's a hobby project or a company project, is you get to work with different kinds of people. Programmers have to talk to artists, have to talk to audio people, have to talk to business people in a way that like you're not just surrounded by your own kind. And I just find that much more kind of enriching, just the day-to-day experience versus kind of being in a bubble of like only my kind of people with our certain kind of mindsets, mentalities, and priorities. Where like we'll do things, if I'm in a pile of just programmers and designers for a while, we'll make something and like an artist will look at me, these colors are horrible. But like then with like 10 minutes of their time, like we pick a palette that somehow makes sense for color theory or things that like I've tried to learn and just don't stick. And like now more people play it longer and don't quit immediately after seeing it. Then I have to have an appreciation for like someone sees things I don't. And the same thing happens in like audio quality of like, this sounds like a gunshot. And a sound guy is like, no, it doesn't. And it's at 44K, we need it at 46K. And it's at like this bit rate, but you need to up that to 256 and we can compress it as a whatever. And I'm like, okay, great. But it builds this appreciation for like, to do things bigger than I can do alone, I have to work with different kind of people. Bit of a tangent there. But, where's I going with that? Talking about
Just the mobile
Oh, the
games,
mobile game, that's
yeah.
right. Okay, so this is a space where certain kinds of work transfer easier than others. Like, there's people who go into game industry as a stepping stone for film industry because they're animators. And like, Pixar needs someone who can do this amazing thing they saw in a cutscene in Call of Duty. But like, the gameplay programmer, less likely to wind up there unless he's working on like the Lord of the Rings fight scene where they have a bunch of monsters swinging swords at each other. And so it depends on what kind of maneuver someone's trying to do. Project manager is an example, and that's someone who like, they're not necessarily hands-in on programming or art or sound or audio. In many cases, they're not. They have to help negotiate those differences in kind between like, all right, you don't speak the artist language and they don't speak the programming language, but I have to speak both your languages enough you don't get mad at each other or confused. Let's do this. That kind of work is extremely versatile, where like that same kind of work is needed in every company on earth, not just the game industry. So if someone's a project manager at mobile game or whatever, then they could be a project manager probably anywhere else and be like, what's your jargon here? The thing about mobile games, and it's like I say, like arcade games kind of came and went. Mobile games that sold for $1 came and went. And any of these things, there's always these questions about like, those are very controlled platforms. Apple and Android, or Apple and Google or whatever, like Amazon to a degree, own these platforms. And it was kind of like Facebook games, kind of came and went. Like they still exist and the numbers of players are staggering for things that like I don't like. But they still exist, but they not in the same way they did. Like one year they took over the industry conferences. It was like all Facebook all the time. That's mostly watered down. And it's because Facebook made a decision to like, we make the following choice about our platform. We're not going to allow the following viral practices or whatever. And those just cease to exist. And so the same thing constantly happens where I have friends who worked on arcade games. And like that's the kind of game that they liked. Or I have friends who worked on, you know, you name it, old platform that's, even MMOs or whatever, for example, where like World of Warcraft was obviously killing it. And a bunch of other companies were like, for a year or two, we have to be the next World of Warcraft. They all wanted to be the next World of Warcraft. And the answer is the next World of Warcraft is still World of Warcraft. Like no one else's attempts at that remotely paid off or stuck. But for a brief window, it was like that was a good area to have some expertise in. So the same thing's happening now in VR, where people are like, oh, there's a demand for it, there's a lot of action, there's a lot of investor money, there's a lot of what we call dumb money, where people who aren't in software engineering or games are like, can we use VR to solve medical problems? Can we use VR to solve training people to do like crafts or whatever? But because that right now it's a lucrative space to be in, but it might have a short half-life on it. And so any one of those kind of things, part of being a game developer is accepting like the rest of your career you're going to have to be learning new things. The rest of your career you're going to have to keep adapting to new kind of stuff. And sometimes it's adapting to like, we didn't do online play at all when I started, but like now it is like essential for certain games. Or, you know, I've got friends who, like they didn't like certain kinds of games, Facebook or otherwise, and had to kind of learn to love it. Because like, well, this is where my career path is taking me for the next several years. Pays well, I got a family to support, got to, you know, whatever go on, and this is what I'm going to do for a while. And their work has since shifted to something else. But for a while, that was like, how do I learn to like the good out of this? So it's, the mobile space in particular is actually one that right now looks appealing from the outside because the game seems smaller. It is a very difficult space to break into. So as a perspective thing, Nintendo Entertainment System, which I played as a child, 850 games ever made for it, plus or minus. That includes imports. Xbox, the original, which I can't call Xbox One anymore, had about like 850, maybe 1,000 games on it as well. And there's kind of like about this number, like 4 digits cap, usually 3-digit games per console before the next cycle comes on, there are about 500 to 700 new mobile games released a day on Android and iOS. This is just absolute tidal wave crashing against the cliffs of people who are like, iPhone looks easy, Android seems easy, I'll put my first game on it, and like no marketing, no attention, no press, not the least of which the people competing against for those same, like they call it the smallest store shelf in the world. There's like 10 games at the top of that app list. Everyone still sees Angry Birds. Everyone still sees whatever EA license they've been able to land on there, whatever. Are the same things year after year in a really sticky, terrifying way of occasionally there's some sort of indie will displace them and there'll be like this crazy breakout of this puzzle game. The thing to realize is like, don't deceive yourself into thinking like they just weekend tooled that together, like kind of hacking at it. If it's on the top of the App Store, someone invested serious money into its art, into its marketing, into it, and like people knew it was not their first game. They've been around 15, 20 years making other games for their consoles, making games for home PC, making games for web, and been like, all right, we're coming into this with dominant experience. And it's just kind of like the example I used in another recent talk is like, it'd be like, okay, if I want to get good at boxing, and I don't know if a professional career and it's right for me or not, then my first fight should not be against a paid professional boxer. I will die, right? And that literally is what happens. Like when someone just like their objective is like, okay, I want to make a game and put it on the Steam store. You are competing against professionals who are getting paid and like at a next level of investment, and to like they're sinking money into it, counting on predictably making more money back on average over the years, and like that's a tough space. So instead it becomes like, okay, well, even if it's not on television or not on the Steam store equivalent, then like where else can we put games? And that's where there's all kinds of other little learning communities, whether it's Steam Greenlight's changed, but again, like the same thing. It is very much Steam used to be a golden ticket back when it was a manually curated garden, and the same thing's true for like N64 launched with like 3 games on the shelf, and like if you were one of those 3 games, your game sold a lot because no other games got on it. But like the trade-off is like no one in the world got to like make games, which was not fun. It really used to be like, and I'm on an email list of these people kind of came up around my time in the indie sphere, where they used to like know the person who knew the person, talk to at Steam or Valve in general to like get their game in front of the right person to consider putting it on there. They would curate, they were like, we're not going to put it on the platform unless it's going to sell, and that's when way fewer games came out. There's now about 13 new games released on Steam a day. If you think about how many of those you've heard of or play, it is very few. And it's partly because they've opened it up to, first it was Greenlight, now it's kind of a Steam Paylight, Rami called it, where it's like you just pay hundreds of dollars or $100 or whatever it is to put your game up there. They don't care if your thing sells or not. They're not having to fight for it. They're making money off Publica and whatever else is up there, and they're just like, buyer beware, take your shot if you want to. But it's not like when iPhone was incredibly new, and this is part of like why when Topple did very well in 08, or my other iPad games, like right when iPad was new, Apple needed to push every game that was decent to like help sell their platform. They want to show like, check out this game only on iPhone, whatever, and like they would like paint the icons on the store tables in the Apple stores, like try to draw attention. Like we have Super Monkey Ball, it's $10, buy it. And like at this point again, like with hundreds of games released a day, like most of them they are like total blinders on, ignored, don't care about. It's not on them to sell it; it's on each individual person. And it really is like if you tried to write a book and then just try to like sell that book yourself without like a publisher involved. And like, it's possible, like it's really hard. It involves like, think about going outside. And the other thing that happens with mobile space that partly contributes to this, even though there's a whole bunch of games, high volume, is like if you try to get someone to install something on their phone, people are really resistant to it. It's kind of like the books on our bookshelf. Like we identify with like, oh yes, that's one of my favorite books. Or like, that's from when I studied whatever. Like there were things where like, I remember early on, I had like a $1 app and I was like, okay, I'll pay you $5 to just try my game. So you're making $4 and getting my game, and people will be like, no. Like that. Wow. This is not worth. It's like not worth the effort to them. They just rather not. Like they want to play something they've heard of that they recognize the brand of, and there's a whole separate challenge from game development that to do it professionally is the marketing business side of like, are people hyped for this? Did they know what it is before it comes out? Are they ready to like? Do they think it's worth their money and their time? And the answer is often like, it's a whole separate challenge and puzzle to solve than can I build it? There's can I position it to stand out? And again, that's why I say it's more like, at this point, being in creative writing or music, of like lots of people can write a story or play a song. How do you make yours stand apart so like you're the equivalent of Lady Gaga in your industry, which is like a remarkably difficult puzzle that involves working with lots of people and making lots of compromises and trade-offs. And like there's no other way besides, it's not like she just made some music and now she was like really important. There's a lot of other stuff that goes on we just don't see.
Mm-hmm.
Who's that person that is their job to make sure that the game sells?
Depends on which way we go. Sometimes, so at a certain scale, there's a publishing layer, and it really is like movies and music or games, where or books or whatever, where like most games don't return their income, don't make back their money. Most games don't sell enough. Even like good games people bank on, count on, think are high quality. And so a publishing layer, what they try to do is diffuse that cost or diffuse that risk. They'll like, okay, well, we'll front the money for 10 games so you can keep your lights on predictably. But we're going to eat 30%, 60%, 70%, 10%, depends how good you negotiate and how much swagger you have. As to like, but if it does well, they're going to eat most of the doing well. But if it does poorly, you at least stayed in business during that time. And so a lot of studios, even ones from like really reputable people, went contract to contract for years with publishers as to like, you've heard of their game, it seemed to have done enormously well, it paid them well enough to like survive another 6 months and try to find another publishing deal. But so sometimes it's the publisher side of like, they decide what to curate, and so there's publishers like, they're like, we reach strategy gamers, or we reach action gamers, we reach sport, 2K's sports or whatever. And like if someone who wants to build a sports game can connect to that publishing layer, they have an incredible advantage in a way they wouldn't otherwise. In a smaller company, it's a marketing person who tries to specialize in like managing those connections, finding ways to give them talks at conferences, ways to try to get their face in front of the right people, ways to try to get them press, hounding with hundreds of emails to like, please write about our game, here's what's interesting about it, here's why it appeals to your readers, we study and care and know about what you care about. But there's a whole layer of like, people gotta know what it is if they're gonna spend any money on it, or even time for that matter.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Thank you, Chris.